Sometimes in economics we call this rent-seeking. The idea refers to the fact that businesses need to spend resources in order to get in the position where they have the monopoly power. There is this rent they want, the monopoly profit. They want that extra money that can only come by being a monopolist, but they have to spend money to get there. And as we're about to see, in the extreme case, they might spend so much money to get that monopolist that they're really not much of a monopolist at all. And let's see how that might happen. Now, in middle school, they taught you, and they taught me too, that governments are perfect. That the government knows that it needs to do what's good for the citizenry. If the government does a bad job, the voters will kick the government out of office and get themselves some new politicians. Well, in that world, the government will decide where it wants monopolies. It might decide, oh, having only one firm land at LaGuardia is a good idea, or we need to encourage inventors, let's have patents. Post office is a good thing. Other areas, it might decide a monopoly is a bad thing. The government might do what is in the best interest of the economy, which is to say the citizens at large. But you know, we're not in middle school anymore. And now we know that government politicians have their own incentives. And part of their incentives is to get more money in campaign donations. Part of their job is to look for jobs for themselves and their relatives after they're out of office. In this kind of world, the government cannot necessarily be relied on to do what's good for its citizens. And so it's a good idea for us to keep track of what's in it for big air, what's in it for the government, and see how the two work together. Think about this. Someone sitting in the White House who runs for re-election might spend these days $1 billion getting re-elected, $1 billion. And his opponents will probably spend about the same amount competing for the right to run against him and then running against him. That's $2 billion in resources spent on the voters. It's very unlikely that a big part of that $2 billion is giving us information that we cannot otherwise get from newspapers and other sources. So that's a kind of waste. That is, people competing for our votes or competing for attention might compete with one another in a kind of arms race where they spend and spend and spend in order to outdo one another, and actually there's a lot of waste involved. The same thing is true on the other side. When Big Air and its competitors compete to get these landing rights at LaGuardia, or somebody competes for the right to build a bridge across the Mississippi River, they too might compete with each other, and they might compete so much as to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And that's what we want to turn to next, to see how rent-seeking can be destructive. Politicians spending on a campaign, would-be monopolists spending for the right to get the monopoly, and countries going to war can all be thought of in one economic model. Economists sometimes call this a pay-all auction. And think of the following metaphor. Imagine an auction in which I bid $10, you bid $12, she bids $14, going, gone, she gets it. We call that a standard auction, or if you want to be fancy, an English auction. It goes to the highest bidder pays the amount bid, and the highest bidder then gets that amount. There are many other kinds of auctions. In a pay-all auction, I bid 10, you bid 12, she bids 14, maybe I bid 16, then I get it for 16, but she has to pay 14 and you have to pay the 12. That is, it's pay-all. Everybody needs to pay the amount of his or her highest bid. Same thing with a campaign. You spend a lot of money on your campaign, I run against you, and I spend a lot of money running against you. One of us wins, none of us gets our money back. It's not like a standard auction where if you lose, at least you don't have to pay. Let's imagine Big Air participating in an auction in order to get its monopoly in the first place. We already know that Big Air can make a lot of money if it's the only one flying from Boston to LaGuardia, but it has to acquire those landing rights. And imagine that the government is auctioning off those landing rights. So one airline can fly the route. Big Air is willing to pay up to $300 for it, let's imagine. But maybe American Airlines is willing to pay $300 as well. And maybe United is also willing to pay $300. They can all see you can make a lot of money being the monopolist here. Now the government puts it out to bid. Of course, it might not do that explicitly. It might be, let's see who can curry favor with the politicians. In that case, the money will really be wasted. Big Air might jump into the fray and spend $100 whining and dining and trying to pay off politicians. But United is not far behind, and it bids $200. And then perhaps American Airlines goes for broke and bids $250. It'll only make $50 if it gets the landing rights because it's going to make $300 and has now spent $250. But from a point of view of Big Air, which has already invested, we might say $100, it pays to invest another $250. That is, even though it will have spent $350 altogether and lose money on the deal, right now it's going to lose $100 and have nothing to show for it. So it might be willing to throw in another $250 to make the $300. Well, following that logic, we can see that if Big Air does that and actually gets the landing rights, Big Air will have spent $350 in order to make $300, and American Airlines will have wasted money, and United Airlines will have wasted money, and the overall rent-seeking can really be quite large. I guess the problem could be even worse. It could be trebled. Politicians might change things. Maybe the government knows that really the best way to run LaGuardia is to have 3 competing airlines. But in its quest to get all this whining and dining and campaign contributions, the government might inefficiently set up LaGuardia only to handle 1 airline in order to get rent-seeking from the airlines. So you see how monopolies and the structure of government begin to fit together. The monopolist gets to make more money once it's a monopoly, but in order to be a monopoly, it often needs the government's help. And in turn, the government might sometimes need the monopoly in order to fuel the politicians and their preferences. This is the very unhappy side of monopoly. I hope you're beginning to see what a seamless web is, this thing we call economics. We started out with prices, and the prices were the little messengers that ran back and forth, coordinating supply and demand. We saw that competition was what happened in the market to create these exchanges. Then we introduced the idea of a monopolist. The monopolist had a market to himself. He was the only one selling the thing, and he could sell the item at a higher price by cutting back on the output, albeit by creating deadweight loss so that there were people whose demand was unsatisfied, even though they wanted to pay a price that the earth could supply the good for. That was the bad side of monopoly. We also saw that there might be a good side to monopoly. The government might want monopolies to create incentives for innovators. The government might want a monopoly to spread the letters around through the postal service. The government in the beginning was seen as the good player that tried to figure out where monopolies were good and where monopolies were bad. Then we introduced complexity and saw, well, the government might not be such a good player. The government might like some monopolies and have an interest in this rent-seeking, in this play by the monopolists to get in the position where they could charge these high prices and keep up barriers to entry that would keep out lower price competitors. In that case, the government is not the solution, but part of the problem. So we have a sort of complex mix where everything we see in government, in monopoly, in competition, and prices begins to interact with one another.